Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, I'm going to be going over my top tier tweaks for some of the strongest archetypes in the format right now, knee-jerk reacting to the LAIC. I believe these are going to be some of the top contenders going into the next set of tournaments, and I think these are the ones that have some big questions to answer when looking at the next set of tournaments. Let's have a breakdown of the top 10 then right now. I believe Entei Valiant has just about snuck into that top 10. This isn't exactly where I would place every deck specifically, but I think these are our top 10 decks. I think Lugia has slipped down out of that top 10. It did get 7 day 2 placements at the LAIC, but the highest place was 87th. And just to put that into perspective, there was a Zorobox and a Clorf Electrode that both finished higher than Lugia. So I think that's definitely damning statistics. I think Roaring Moon also did quite poorly, so that's also kind of like vying for the top 10 placement where it really didn't do all that well. But I think Roaring Moon showed up in other archetypes here and there, proving itself as a strong card, and I think there's still time and logic around why Roaring Moon should remain in that top 10, because just looking at the finals, being solid into Entei Valiant, being solid into Miraidon, and then countering the counter, which Mew is also good against Valiant and Miraidon. Roaring Moon should sort of find a way, find its footing in this format, I believe. Possibly there could be some different adaptations to deck lists. I've been trying different varieties myself, but also it could have just been too heavily targeted. It was too on the radar going into the LAIC, and now that the goalposts have shifted towards how do I beat Miraidon, how do I beat Gardevoir, these sorts of things, maybe there's a more clear runway for Roaring Moon to remain a contender in the top 10. Let me know your thoughts on that down below. Does it deserve to even be in this top 10 after such a poor performance compared to Lugia, which, you know, has its own struggles but also has its own toys to play with? And Snorlax Stall is also an interesting one among that top 10. It had like a really good spike in the tournament, getting a top 8 placement. Could have taken out the whole thing if it had better matchup into that top cut as well. So definitely a contentious one. I know that going into Europe, there's probably going to be a decent contingent of controlling players. I know a lot of the Italian players, there'll be a number of those pilots using block. And I think there's likely going to be, well, Sander's going to bring some sort of creation. They weren't at the LAIC, so it's the first time we get to unveil a new type of control, possibly with a lot of these toys as well, so definitely on my personal radar. But I think this is a pretty good outline of what the top 10 decks are. I think the sort of breakdown of the 5 at the top seem like the best decks, and the 5 at the bottom are vying for contention in and among them as well. So just my current take on the top 10 decks, not too dissimilar to what we were expecting, to be honest with you, with Valiant kind of overperforming, I would guess, and also Miraidon actually outperforming its, online data, at least heading up into the tournament as well. We'll start with Gardevoir EX then. It was littering the day 2 and had not only a good conversion rate, but then also a great conversion deep into the top 8 as well, with 3 Gardevoir lists making top 8 or better. And I think it's really interesting to see the breakdown of these Gardevoir lists, because there is still a lot of division among even successful deck lists where we have a big couple of key decisions here. There's a debate around whether or not we should be still playing the heavy Battle VIP Pass plus Mysterious Tail Mew combination, where oftentimes you will look to grab Mew in the opening stages, then Mew will try and cherry pick VIP Pass to go wide on the opening stages. This allows you to not only develop the early rolts in multiple counts to safeguard yourself around bosses' orders or spread plays, you can also develop early Radiant Greninja to get drawing cards. You can develop early Manaphy to protect yourself from Greninja as well. So I do think there's a lot of extra defense you can get and extra deck thinning naturally from a VIP pass build, but that's kind of coming up against Lumineon plus having heavy Ultra Ball, heavy Fog Crystal, heavy Level Ball. This list intends to lean more heavily into the Mirage step, but having the 4th copy of Ultra Ball makes Lumineon a stronger card in the deck list, and it allows you to cherry pick some of your crucial supporter cards, not only getting you that early game Professor's Research to have a deep dig into the deck, but also the timing of the likes of Avery could be much more precise and much more powerful when you're able to combine this with, counter catcher plays, or knowing that you can Avery into Screamtail, these sorts sorts of combinations, the Lumineon does kind of make that happen, and it gives you better late game outs towards, hitting your boss's orders if you're digging for that for game, that sort of thing. So there is a bit of a trade-off going on here. VIP Plus obviously takes up a lot of space, and there will be a number of games where these just become trade bait, obviously, with your Curliers, and you're often still looking to Mirage Step in a number of matchups. Whereas the Lumineon build really relies on Mirage Step. I feel that's much more the case, and I think it can struggle a little bit more against the Valiant builds, struggle a little bit more against Iron Hands, but I do think that you give yourself extra supporter tutor, which obviously has big upsides. The next debate is Cresselia or Jirachi. It's possible that the Gardevoir players are being quite greedy right now, choosing to play Cresselia over Jirachi, seeing as though we've just seen Yogaloop get the finals of an international championships, and of course this still gives you great defense into Lost Zone variants, and of course Tina and Lost Zone Box both made it into the top 8 as well, so the Comfey Colress engine is still certainly viable. The Cresselia is much more versatile, there's no doubt about that. It's a decent card in the mirror, good against dealing with, Bidoof, Pidgey, lots of lower hit point basics, in a similar way to Screamtail, but it's just an alternate option that can find its way naturally into your hand. It's, not blocked by Manaphy, of course, so it's still a very valid attacker, and it still gives you some percentages into the Lost Zone variant, so it's by no means a bad card, especially similar to Screamtail, it gets better with Countercatcher as well, where you can bring certain things up, Moonglow something on the bench, then give your opponent the headache of having to pivot something at the same time. So I think the card is just kind of more valuable with the cards that are already being introduced into the deck list, but I do think it's very reasonable to jump ship over to the Jirachi, which is that harder tech card, because we have this new pretty bad matchup, which could end up being, a much more popular archetype going into the next set of regionals with Yogaloop in hand. So being able to protect yourself from the 2-turn plays that a Metacham can have, where your opponent can really wipe your board clean with a number of Valiants, not just over one turn, but over a couple of turns with no response and not allowing you to evolve up, is pretty massive, actually, I would say. And then the final question is Professor Churro's scenario alongside Palpad. I think these kind of work as a package deal together, because by playing the two cards together, you end up giving yourself a reasonable time into block Snorlax. I think with the one copy of Boss, Churro, and Palpad, you give yourself enough ways to get around block that you can make life difficult for the opponent, especially because you're already going to be spamming Iono when they are trying to gain resources with Rotom. You're making life difficult for them to chain their most powerful turns. You're of course going to try and go wide with what can become viable attackers with your Gardevoir line and not really feed them the easy cards. You obviously have Ultra Ball in the deck list as well as Super Rod, and you have Curly's refining these Pokemon away as well. So you've got a lot of draw power on your side. You can make these supporters come together. You can protect things like Palpad in the hand quite nicely just by holding a large hand size, and I think it is a reasonable matchup if you play the combination. Without the combination, I think you instantly lose to a ton of things. Not only that, Churro scenario is really good in a ton of situations. I found it pretty solid in a mirror match as well, actually. The mirror is super interesting for Gardevoir, one of the most interesting and chaotic games, actually, because both decks are so good at dealing with the other's engine via attacking with Cress and Screamtail, with Avery now in there as well, with constant spam of Iono as you're taking single prize knockouts over the turn. It's a really long, drawn-out game, and in many situations, by going ahead in a prize race, you actually activate many cards in the opponent's deck to construct lots of comeback win conditions. By playing the Churro scenario in your deck list, you're able to deny an opponent from a game plan where they just keep pace prize for prize with you, because they can use a Churro scenario, pick up their Gardevoir towards the end of the game, then go down to one prize card if they've powered up multiple threats, knowing that you can't respond with the counter catcher play on their EX and take a 2-prize KO. So it actually is quite nice in the mirror match. It can be, in all sorts of situations, a great way to pick up a 2-prizer as well, of course. Even get extra, refines in the turn by picking up your Gardevoir EX line in full, putting down a Curlier, trading again, and then having that space available to evolve into an EX in its own right. So I feel like the combination is very powerful, and I feel personally it's worthwhile, but it of course is taking up a couple spaces. These could just be, more research, more Iono, more Worker, more Avery, these sorts of cards. and that's the big debate here. With all that said, this is my current deck list. I still land at the Battle VIP Pass camp with Celebrations Mew. I still feel like this is strong enough. I am down to 3 copies and up to 3 copies of Fog Crystal, so a small concession there that I do like having the extra tutor, the extra thinning of the Psychic Energy, and just because it's such a good tutor for Screamtail and Zacian in the late game, making sure you have the search for these cards throughout is always a nice thing. You'll see that I am playing Churro Pad. I think it's worthwhile and just a really versatile option, and I don't want to just instantly lose to a matchup in control. Because I'm playing the Pal Pad, it gives me the license to play the Worker, the 1 copy of Boss's Orders alongside 1 Counter Catcher, because recovering Boss with Pal Pad is still a viable option for us. And the Vacuum comes in, so I'm only playing 1 copy of Collapse Stadium. Again, because I'm playing Churro, I'm able to do the gymnastics of going down to 1 physical stadium card, because I have Collapsed plus Vacuum plus Worker Pad, gives me 4 total bounces to Path of the Peak, which should be plenty really, especially when you still have Reversal Energy that can be used on off turns without abilities. And Vacuum is just really strong right now. You're pretty terrified of a Bravery Charmed Iron Hands. There can also be some chunky Roaring Moon. You can actually vacuum away Luxurious Cape on Screamtail in some mirror match situations if your opponent is choosing to play it. I think it's just a super versatile option. And of course, in this deck list at least, because we are still playing that Celebrations Mew, it's a little bit more searchable throughout the mid game. I think the counts that I'd consider buffing up in this deck list would be a 2nd copy of Avery if you don't really like the one-of copy of Research. It's a little bit random because I don't have the Luminion in here, but it does just add to your overall good supporters in the opening stages. And of course, it can be something that you Pal Pad back in the deck in the late game, and can actually be really good in the mirror match as well, where, like I say, both players' engines can be picked apart a little bit here and there, so having that deep dig with Research, even towards the late game, can actually be pretty big for the mirror. So I still stand by the 1 copy of Research, even though it stands out like a sore thumb. And I do know a number of players did well with 2 copies of Counter Catcher. It just allows you to see the card more frequently, gives you more lines of play with the Screamtail where it comes together quite nicely, and essentially gives you more than just a 1-turn gambit that the 1 Counter Catcher is kind of doing in this deck list, where you have to line it up nicely with Iono to get the full value in a lot of situations. Onto Charizard then. It's a really interesting one that previously Lost City was like a staple stadium card in pretty much every Charizard EX list, actually. It felt like everyone just accepted that City was correct. It was good against Lost Zone, it was good against Gardevoir, and basically no one batted an eyelid at this choice. However, we've seen in the most recent international championships that different stadiums were incorporated by actually the creators of the deck, the Brazilian contingent of players, ended up playing Temple of Sinnoh and Collapse Stadium in a combination in their deck list. The Temple of Sinnoh, of course, trying to be a hiccup for Gardevoir players where they no longer have access to their Reversal Energy for big response KO plays. Of course, Gardevoir does have a number of stadium bouncers already in its deck list, but it can be something you can try and actually use alongside Iono to cause a little bit more headache and make it a little bit less easy for them to get an uptrade. It doesn't take much for Charizard to get a little bit ahead of the Gardevoir players. There's that same debate around Pal Pad Churro. It's also a decent card in this deck list. Again, the combination of these two plus the Escape Rope that's already in the deck list gives you some chance into the block lax. And of course, we've previously seen Penny in the deck list, and it has a very similar function here, where it can help you pick up your Luminion, pick up your Entei, or pick up some damaged EX Pokemon as well, if ever you need to. And the debate rages on over Bibarel or Pidgeot. The Pidgeot builds placed highest at the LAIC, but there was still a good density of TM Evo Charizards. It was still very popular and still seemed to be relatively successful as well. So there's still going to be a back and forth around this. I think more people will gravitate towards Pidgeot because, again, those had the highest placements from some high-profile Brazilian players. But that's not to say that Bibarel is going to completely just go back into the shadows. I think there's still a lot of valid reasons to think about a Bibarel build instead, especially because it's a great way to defend yourself against Iron Valiant, actually. You immediately get your Bidoof and your vulnerable Charmanders up into much more respectable hit points, so the opponent can't just use Iron Valiant, Tachyon Bits all over the place, and then Yoga Loop all over you. I've still got the most experience with the Pidgeot build of Charizard, so that's the list that I am defaulting to right now, and like I said, it was the most successful list. If you do want to react to the Valiant though, TM Evolution is definitely reasonable, and I think that could be popping up more and more as we head into the next set of regionals. I still feel Lost City is very strong. Giving yourself percentage into Gardevoir, because we've just seen how popular it is always pretty handy, and I think Churro Pad also makes its space in the deck list. And because I only want to commit one space in my deck list, I feel like having the Defiance ban makes more sense, whereas if you're committing 2 spaces, I can definitely see the value in the Justified Gloves plus the Vitality Band combining in the deck list. Onto Miraidon then, the big winner of the LAIC, with the Seniors and Masters Division both seeing this deck come out on top. Interestingly enough, it was two different builds that ended up taking the win. The Masters Division list was playing a couple copies of Path of the Peak and a heavier Iono count, whereas the Senior Division list was going up to 2 double turbo energies, 2 Iron Hands, and Beach Courts to really lean into very early amp you very much pressure. I think the Path of the Peak build does still give you some extra percentage into Charizard, which is one of your trickier matchups, can sometimes come up in the mirror match now as well, and if you still expect Roaring Moon, I think Path is still a really reasonable combination. But if you're expecting a lot of racing decks and then basically just Lost Box and Guardi, there's nothing better than having Beach Court double turbo at your side, so you can really get some powerful amp you very much pressure. Another thing I've been really impressed with using a double turbo list is how much better Mew EX becomes as an attacking threat. There's actually many more situations where you can get your Mew EX into the mix with a Flaffy plus a double turbo energy attachment and Boss's Orders combination. You can bring up Radiant Greninjas and have those snipe plays. Even if it is just a 70-70, we know that's still a crucial threshold for Comfey, for Ralts. Obviously Gardevoir players are damaging themselves heavily as well, so you can usually find situations where this is also going to be online. I think the final debate really is, do you go for the full double Iron Hands? That was again what the Seniors list went for. There are situations where just immediately getting your next Iron Hands and powering it back up in a turn is possible, again, especially with 2 double turbo energy in your deck list. It can be as simple as attach double turbo, get 1 generator hit and Flaffy onto your guy, and immediately you have your next Ampy very much ready to rumble. Whereas playing a Super Rod makes it a little bit less easy for you to get that instant reload, but it does have that versatility and helping you safeguard around your own Professor's Research. There are situations where you have to throw away a Flaffy, then your other one's in the prize cards. You have to get rid of Zapdos early and it becomes really useful. You get rid of your Raichu early as well. That's a really great late game card and can always be part of your late game win condition. Super Rod's one of these cards that has to just find its way in the hand at a different point, but it's just so much more flexible than simply an extra copy of just one of your attackers because you play such a versatile combination of cards in your deck list right now. In the same vein, Hisuian Heavy Ball can be another way to sort of safeguard yourself around some prizing. Mew EX can be really important. Raichu, obviously Iron Hands, if you just play the 1 copy in Hisuian, you're sort of covering your bases that little bit better than just having that secondary copy. Onto the deck list then, and I am preferring the 2 double turbo energy to support the Iron Hands. And like I said, I've been really impressed with this combination alongside Mew EX. I feel like it really just makes the genome hacking much more viable in this deck. So definitely something you should watch out for because it's actually a massive play that you get into the list. But that said, I am expecting a lot of racing 2 prizing decks, and I think that really leans into the Beach Court and makes this deck just even more aggressive. I've also done the flip-flop over to switches over switch carts. I think you're a lot less subtle and interesting of a matchup, to be honest with you, against Lost Box. I think you're really just trying to get the Ampy very much additional prizes in. You're trying to get the Mew EX additional prizes in, so you need much less of your healing tactics. Plus, the fact that you play Switch now really helps out against Giratina and against Gardevoir. These are matchups where you will try and get at least 1 Flaffy down, but it then becomes a counter-catcher stalling target, especially alongside Iono or Roxanne. So having double turbo Switch over Switch Cart now, and Rope in the deck list, and the Arvens in there as well, gives you so many avenues to move your Flaffy immediately, so you're not slowed down by Screamtail or Sableye Sprinkle plays, and you get right back into the mix. Lost Vacuum is a really strong card. It's an extra defense against Path of the Peak, but of course there's Bravery Charms in the mirror match, there's Bravery Charms sometimes in Entei, there's Roaring Moon health buff tools as well, so being able to burst through these sorts of attackers is really handy. The final note is the cheeky one-off Poker Gear. I've played a decent amount of Miraidon now. I played it in the Leo Regional Championships and a number of League Cups. I personally really like the Poker Gear. It's like a 0.5 of a Boss's Orders, it's 0.5 of an Iono, it's helping you get towards research, it's an insta-playable card at the very least, so you can just burn it from your hand to help with restart from Mew. It can also be a card that you play before Generator to give you a tiny bit of extra percentages here and there. I feel like it's just much more flexible and versatile than playing simply a 4th copy of Professor's Research, which is a very good card, don't get me wrong, but sometimes Research is blocked by having the Raichus, the Zapdos, other Pokemon like this trapped in your hand, and the Poker Gear can let you fish for other things for the situation. Because this deck is very honest and uses mostly 2 prize attacking Pokemon, it really is awful to miss your beats with Boss or miss your beat with Iono if you are weaving in the 1 prize Pokemon. The Poker Gear sitting sort of between these cards, rather than being an actual additional copy, is a really handy thing to have, I think. The last archetype I want to look in great detail into is the Lost Zone archetype. There's the first debate of whether we should play Charizard or Radiant Greninja. The data hasn't really helped us out too much. Yes, Charizard made the only top 8 placement of the Lost Zone builds, but there was an equal number of Charizard and Turbo Greninja based lists in day 2 of the tournament, so both are doing relatively well and surviving. Both of these decks actually have to ask the question whether or not it is worth playing Roaring Moon EX and Darkness Energy. We saw that Brennan Kammerman included gates into the Charizard list. This allows you to get very early Combustion Blast response pressure onto Iron Hands, which is massive, but it also opens the door for you to have Dark type coverage from Roaring Moon, helping out against Mew, helping out against Gardevoir at times, and giving you Frenzied Gouging into Charizard as well. Whereas for Radiant Greninja, you're already trying to juggle a number of different type-coloured energy, with Lightning, with Water, with Psychic, pretty much being guaranteed in the deck list. Adding in Dark Energy does take up some space and makes you wiggle around your energy counts that little bit more, but you have those same upsides that I just mentioned in the Charizard approach. When looking at some of the Turbo Greninja lists, I did see some interesting stuff. Yes, there were some incorporating Roaring Moon. There's also a decent number playing Iron Hands in the deck list. Again, if you're naturally using Lightning Energy for Dragonite or Raikou, these V Pokemon that use Forest Seal Stone, obviously Iron Hands is just another very impressive attacking threat, and it's no surprise to see it make a space in here. Oftentimes you'll see Raihan coming into these sorts of builds just to make it a little bit easier for the Iron Hands to come online. That said though, still a really solid option to have in your deck list. Another really interesting list I saw from a Chilean player, similar to the deck list we saw get second place at the Leo Regional Championships with the Cancelling Clone plus Cross Witcher package. There was actually a double Cancelling Clone, double Counter Catcher list of Lost Box going around with heavy Pokestop. I thought that was a really interesting take to give you extra ways of taking multiple prize knockouts with that Moonlight Shuriken. Obviously the timing of this has to be correct because you're leaning into Counter Catcher and Turbo Lost Box is kind of known for being more aggressive, so it might make you play a little bit differently with the list, but it does give you so many avenues to actually take multi-prize turns, which I thought was really interesting. For the Charizard list, I just have to trust Brennan. They've played Lost Box for so long that they are just an expert. I'm playing 59 cards the same. My personal preference is to play double Roxanne over Rox Iono, because Iono feels like the worst enemy of this deck, so giving myself more cards always seems like the most reasonable, even though, yes, of course, you are giving yourself minus percentage to just kind of play the game if Iono happens to be in your opening hands. I feel that's negligible. And then for Turbo, I do think incorporating the Roaring Moon makes the most sense. Having the type coverage seems really reasonable to me right now, otherwise you can have a pretty poor time into Mew, an archetype that I still certainly respect. Raihan really helps out in this deck list, like I said, because we play such a messy energy count. This can be a great way for you to fix your gates, allow you to get Super Rod into the mix as well, so you're just getting online with your multi-prize attackers. This list is heavily inspired from Adam Hawkins' successful list in day 2 as well. The final considerations I have going into the next set of tournaments really revolve around Roaring Moon and Mew. Should we be putting Roaring Moon in the bin because it did quite poorly at the LAIC? Or is it better positioned now, seeing the 2 decks that made the finals and seeing that Gardevoir was the most popular deck at the LAIC? Certainly it did well, but the counters have already been established. We've seen that Iron Valiant's a challenge for it. We've seen that Iron Hands coming onto the field early can be a challenge for it. Does it mean that the overall percentage will drop for Gardevoir going into these new set of tournaments? If that's the case, Roaring Moon's going to have a better position. It likes fighting the 2 prize versus 2 prize fight, and is happy to see any dropped percentage for Gardevoir. And then the next real question is Mew worth teching against? It almost made top 8. Let's not forget that a double Turbo Energy build did get 9th at the LAIC. Once again, the 2 decks that made the finals don't have that good of a time into Mew. So if you're thinking about playing one of those archetypes, is it an easy squeeze of a Drapion V coming into the deck? Or do you just hope that there are going to be Lost Zone builds incorporating Roaring Moon naturally? There'll still be enough Roaring Moon and Charizard in the room. And I also think that Gardevoir gains some extra percentage into Mew as well, as Avery can be a really annoying supporter that you can spam against Mew players to hinder their draw engine and actually allow your Ionos to be quite valuable towards the late game. For me personally, as I said towards the beginning of the video, I do think Roaring Moon is a powerful enough inherent deck to hang in this format and remain in the top 10. So if you did see quite a poor performance, it wouldn't necessarily make me falter from the deck. It might make me change a few cards within my deck list, but I do think it's still a certainly viable archetype in the game and has a ton of merit. And there's the constant threat of Mew. I know it never feels good to commit a space to your deck list for a deck that is probably not going to be in the top 5 of popularity if I had to make a guess, but we know that these decks do rise to the top tables because when unchecked, they can have really deep runs. Let me know what you guys thought about the layout of this video. Let me know what you think about the deck lists and the discussion around the debates going on with these lists right now. For the other top contenders that I didn't show, I think Giratina, Chen Pao, Entei Valiant, and Blocklax, I think their lists aren't necessarily refined down to the perfect 60, but I think they're much less likely to make huge jumps outside of 1 or 2 cards here and there. The other ones still seem much more up in the air. There's the debate around which Lost Box you should be playing, which Mew you should be playing, how we should even play Roaring Moon if it's not yet had success, and as I discussed with the other deck lists, a handful of other questions to be asked as well. Hope you enjoyed today's video, and I'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.